Hi, Cosmic Hamsters here with Hamster Bites, the bite-sized podcast all about hamsters. Thanks for bearing with me, guys, while I got this episode out. I totally had issues with my vocal cords in April, so this is why there was no episode in May. So hopefully, well, I've been quite ill in May as well, but hopefully we're back on track to get an episode a month out. So sorry about that, but it is what it is. In this episode, I want to talk all about hamster bedding, including what type of bedding is safe or unsafe and how much should we be using. Depending where you live in the world, there are quite a few different types of bedding you can use. The main ones are paper, hemp and aspen or spruce wood shavings. You want to avoid softwoods such as cedar or pine because these can cause respiratory issues. You also want to avoid any shavings if it is not specified which type of wood they are from, as chances are they will be cedar or pine based. Also, avoid all sawdust because quite simply it's just too dusty and can cause respiratory issues as well. One thing to be aware of is when pet stores sell sawdust as shavings, you don't want them either. Sawdust is going to be very fine, whereas shavings will look like bigger thin flakes of wood. So if you can actually look at what is inside the bag, that will help you decipher if it really is shavings and not sawdust, unless it is a well-known brand such as Gypsy, for example. I don't actually have any personal experience of using Gypsy, but a lot of people use it. You also want to be avoiding anything scented because again, this can cause respiratory issues and just be overpowering for the hamsters. However, coloured paper bedding is fine, again, just make sure that it isn't scented. You also want to avoid fluffy bedding, aka Kapok or cotton wool. This is because it can get tangled up in the hamster's digestive tract if they digest any of it. Mark Diner, one of the co-founders from Hamster Welfare, has this well documented as he sadly went through this with his hamster Poppy, and unfortunately he isn't the only one who's gone through this with a hamster. Even if they don't digest it, it can get tangled in their teeth and impacted in their pouches. This happened to a hamster which my friend Carrie at Home Sweet Hammy Home rescued. It's a mouthful. It took many attempts and vet visits to get all the bedding out the hamster's teeth and pouches. This type of bedding can also get tangled around limbs as well. Honestly, it's just best to avoid it altogether. It's just not worth the risk of any of these things happening to your hamster. In the UK and USA, some of the main providers of paper bedding are KT, Carefresh, Small Pet Select, Book Estate and Night Angel. And in the UK, we also have Fitch First and Hope's Healthy Treats. In the UK, we also have access to Megazord bedding, which is probably one of, if not the cheapest type of bedding. It's a virgin wood pulp fibre bedding and it's the bedding I mainly used when I first started adopting hamsters. I know some people don't like it due to the smell and sometimes people can find it a bit dusty, but I never found it worse than some of the paper bedding, and it is good if you're on a budget. You definitely get a lot for your money. If you are going to use this, the same with wood shavings and hemp bedding, I would still recommend to use some softer paper type bedding in the area where your hamster is actually sleeping. Somewhere along the way in my hamster care, I started to use 3 different types of bedding in my cages, and if you look at some of my old cage setup videos on my YouTube channel, Cosmic Hamsters, you will see some examples of where I used Megazorb, or Boyos, which is a hemp bedding, and a paper-based bedding, probably KT or Fitch First. Then I swapped to all paper-based bedding. I went through a stage of using just Fitch First, then that went up in price, so I swapped to KT, and I got that on Amazon Subscribe and Save, so I could save a bit of money. I did often like to add a splash of colour as a top layer and would use either Carefresh or Book Estate coloured bedding. I tend to avoid white Carefresh bedding just because of a bad experience I had when using it with one of my hamsters, Star. She had a reaction to it. I think it was the amount of dust in it and it caused both her eyes to close up after she had been burrowing in it, so I swapped the bedding and she was fine. For some reason, I've never had a problem with the Carefresh coloured bedding being dusty like that. In my experience, when it comes to paper bedding, I think KT seems to be the softest paper bedding and Carefresh can sometimes be a bit hard, whereas Fitch First is somewhere in the middle of the two. For some reason, in all the years of keeping hamsters, I am yet to try Small Pet Select's paper bedding. So if any of you out there have used that, let us know if you recommend it or not in the comments. That would be very helpful for any listeners out there. Some of you may also have heard of or come across tea bag bedding. This is bedding that comes from the leftover pieces from when making tea bags. I personally don't use it or recommend it because I don't know what stage it's being collected at in the tea bag process or which tea company the bedding is coming from, and a lot of them still use plastics in the tea bags. So if there's any plastic in it, I can't compost it. When tea bag bedding first came on the scene a few years ago, I did reach out to a couple of companies that sold it to see if they could clarify at what stage of the process it was obtained and which companies they obtained it from, but they never replied. Some people also add thin layers of hay to the bedding they are using, which can help with keeping burrows stable, but I'm allergic, so I don't do that, and I also haven't really found it necessary. My hamsters have managed to make burrows in just paper bedding. So, on to the big question, how much bedding should we actually be using for our hamsters? Way back in the day, I think some people actually recommended 3 inches of bedding, and this is just so sad because that's just not deep enough for hamsters to do anything in and would have required constantly changing due to getting soiled very quickly. And if you didn't know, changing bedding frequently can cause hamsters to be stressed, but to be fair, they were probably already stressed if they only had 3 inches of bedding. Then, for a long while, it used to be recommended to have 6 inches of bedding, and I think that probably just came about because that's approximately the depth of the base of a lot of barred hamster cages, especially those that are around the 80 by 50 centimetre size or larger. And now you can see anything recommended from 8 to 12 inches or more, and God help you if you don't have that amount of bedding because the hamster police will come after you if you are an inch short of what they think your bedding depth should be. Get your rulers out, guys. In all seriousness, I personally use 10 to 12 inches of bedding and would recommend 10 inches plus, but I think we have to be a bit realistic here, as I know how long it took me to be able to get that much bedding in my cages due to the adaptations and the amount of platforms I had to make myself for it to work in my cages. So I know it depends on a few things to how much bedding others can get in their cages too. These will be primarily the height of the cage and the size of the hamster wheel, because when adding the wheel height and the bedding depth height, you need to be able to fit both in your enclosure with the wheel still being able to go round without it hitting the lid or ceiling of the cage. Don't forget, if your wheels are going on top of all of that bedding, they must go on a platform unless they're being attached to the cage somehow. It's just so your hamster doesn't get squashed if they decide to burrow underneath the wheels. One way around this is to put less bedding underneath where your wheel is if you haven't got a platform. It's going to have the bedding kind of sloping from a lower height to a taller height. I have done that in the past, but just prefer everything on platforms these days, with roughly an equal amount of bedding across the whole cage. I just find it easier to set up like that and for the hamsters to navigate. Research shows us that Andrina Hausenberger, Sabine Gebhardt Henrik and Andreas Steiger, 2005, I hope I pronounced those names right, found that golden hamsters, aka Syrian hamsters, showed less wire gnawing in bedding depth of 40 centimetres, 15.7 inches, than hamsters housed in 10 centimetres, 4 inches bedding depth, and no wire gnawing was observed in those housed in 80 centimetres, 31.5 inches bedding depth. All the hamsters using the 40 and 80 centimetre deep bedding also made burrows. So the conclusion was that it suggests a combination of a big cage with deep bedding could be a great improvement for the welfare of Syrian hamsters. As I also previously stated in my last podcast all about cages, I would also suggest proper enrichment would make a huge difference too, and we are going to cover that in future episodes of Hamster Bites. So stay tuned for them. So why don't we recommend 40 centimetre, 15 plus inches of bedding? Well, realistically, unless you are making your own cage or getting a custom sized enclosure built, there is no cage currently on the market that I know of that would allow you to put 40 to 80 centimetres of bedding plus the correct size wheel for your hamster on top. You would be looking at something over 70 centimetres to 1.10 metres plus to be able to do that. There used to be a cage called the Skyline Falco that was 75 centimetres high. It had a glass bottom with a metal wire top. I'm just not sure how deep the actual glass base was. I know it was very heavy though. For comparison, my IKEA Compliment cage, which I made, is 57 centimetres high, and my Living World Eco Habitat medium cage is 61 centimetres high. And so I can get maximum 10 to 12 inches of bedding in them with a 12-inch wheel. If you have a barred cage and want to get more bedding in it, you can add things like cardboard, grass mats or perspex onto the side to enable adding more bedding into the cage. I have a video about this on my Cosmic Hamsters YouTube channel, and I have written about it in a blog about barred cages that I co-wrote for the website Hamster Welfare with the other co-founder of Hamster Welfare, Tiffany Key. So you might want to check that out too. I will put links in the description if any of you want to watch or read these. Sometimes in the online hamster community, you may see people arguing over the depth of bedding or telling people they are abusing their hamsters because their bedding isn't deep enough by 1 inch. Trust me, I have seen many people arguing over bedding depth over the years, and in some situations, even rescues have been attacked about this. But some things to think about when you see cage setups without a lot of bedding. If it is a rescue, rescues have limited funds, and it is not always practical or cost efficient for them to fill all their rescue cages with something like 10 inches of bedding, especially when the animals will hopefully be soon adopted, and then the cage needs to be set up again for new intake. And in case you didn't know, the bedding can't be reused for another hamster due to the scent from the previous hamster. It could be distressing to the new hamster. It is probably more important for a rescue's limited funds to go towards things like vet bills than bedding. Lower bedding can also help them keep an eye on new intakes, especially when an illness may be suspected. This doesn't just apply to rescues. Sometimes people might not have a lot of bedding in their enclosures due to having a mite/bug infestation and need to keep replacing the bedding or checking for mite/bugs. Or they might have an elderly or poorly hamster and might be in more of a hospital cage setup so they can move around easier and or be monitored more easily and medicine applied easily if need be. It could also just be pure lack of knowledge and experience by the hamster owner. So I always think when you come across a picture or a video of a cage without a lot of bedding, it's always good to have a think about that there might be a reason behind it, especially before starting to accuse someone of animal abuse. Munchies Place did a great video a while back talking about and showing different heights of bedding, and I recommend going to give that a watch. Again, I will link that in the description. I do want to say that I sometimes see it recommended to reduce the amount of bedding to help tame a hamster. Personally, I don't agree with this or think it is necessary. I think a hamster should feel safe in their new home, and I think one way for them to feel this is by having deep enough bedding to burrow down into and feel safe. This just might mean it takes a little bit longer to tame a hamster, but I'm okay with that. I like to work at the pace of my hamsters when it comes to taming and not to force anything with them. So, to end this month's podcast, over on our YouTube post, I asked our followers if they had a favourite type of hamster bedding, and if so, why. The answers I got back were Fitch First because of softness and lack of dust, Night Angel again because of softness, and Carefresh. I also did a poll and asked how many inches of bedding people used in their hamster cage, and the results were that most people answered 6 to 8 inches, and then behind that people voted equally for 8 to 10 inches and 10 inches plus, and voted in last place was less than 6 inches, and I think that was just because of the type of cage the person had and it was the most they could fit in at the time. I hope you found this month's podcast helpful, and don't forget, having enough bedding isn't the only thing a hamster requires, so stay tuned for future episodes of Hamster Bites where I will discuss what else hamsters need. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay cosmic!